Hello and welcome to the CX Files podcast for January 20th, 2022. I'm Mark Hillary in Sao Paulo, Brazil.
And I'm Peter Ryan here in freezing Montreal, Quebec, Canada, where it is a balmy minus 25 this morning, Mark.
Well, now, we're looking at a bit more like plus 25 here.
Yeah, that's right. 50 degrees of separation in temperature. That's wild. But Mark, I'm really excited for our pod today because in the episode that we're publishing today on January 20th, we're going to be talking to Scott Broetzmann, the president of Customer Care Management and Consulting. Scott's based in Virginia in the United States, close to Washington, D.C., where you and I both have a number of friends.
I just didn't envision 20 years ago, this was the quote that they pulled, that this would, be what it is today, where people are beating the living hell out of one another on airplanes for various kinds of things, some of them political, some not political.
Yes, Scott's company has been researching customer anger and rage for almost 2 decades now. They survey the American public most years to get a semi-annual survey. And I learned about his work from a recent feature in the New York Times. And I saw that both of us actually separately shared this New York Times feature about customer anger. And they really explored from many different experts, why are customers more angry today? And does it have anything to do with the pandemic?
Customer anger is a real thing, Mark. And up until we read up until we listened to Scott's interview that you conducted with him, I actually had anecdotally been seeing a lot of this. And it didn't matter if it was the supermarket, at the airport, the train station. You could be anywhere and customers seem to be taking a much more aggressive tone. And Scott's research really, I think, identifies a number of key facets as it relates to the level of anger and the level of rage that customers seem to be having these days, which is why I think this is a very topical interview as we go into 2022.
Okay, so shall we have a quick look at the news before going into the interview with Scott? Any stuff caught your eye recently?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, something that caught my eye in terms of the CX industry was the fact that Qualphone has announced that it's opening up in Colombia. Now, this was published in Nearshore Americas over the course of the past few days, and it really hit home for me, Mark, because as we know, Colombia has become really, I think, a great go-to location for a lot of different organizations from a CX delivery perspective. And it's interesting to note as well that in the Colombian experience, it recently was rated the most favored, or not most favored, but the location that rated highest in the offshore BPO confidence index that was published by Cognitive Copy and Ryan Strategic Advisory just last month.
Okay, and I have another acquisition story that I think will play out and be very interesting, and that's Microsoft. Microsoft just bought Activision Blizzard, the gaming company, but this is a $75 billion deal, so this is huge. And I think that why this is going to be interesting as we move forward is the fact that gaming, and especially gaming when you're talking about a gaming universe as big as Activision Blizzard, people within this kind of universe are already used to the metaverse. People that spend time inside games like Fortnite are very familiar with the idea of having virtual friends and existing within a virtual world. I think that Microsoft will be able to use a lot of that expertise, and they may well be able to compete with Facebook, who's clearly betting everything on the metaverse. But I think that you may well see it influencing how business apps like LinkedIn function in future, and how we see industries like retail, for example.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Mark. It's very true. And that was a very, very big acquisition. And interestingly enough, as we see the gaming industry become a much bigger part of the CX dynamic, it'll be interesting to see how this M&A activity plays out. I'd be curious to see what you've been picking up on LinkedIn of late.
Yeah, I've seen fewer polls this week. Certainly last week we were talking about that. Yeah, exactly. We were talking about it, and for some reason it doesn't seem as bad this week, but it seems very strange that anything would have suddenly changed. I just wanted to mention an experiment I'm doing on LinkedIn tomorrow. As we're recording this on the 20th, If you hear this before Friday 21st, then check out my profile, because I'm going to be putting a link up to a new audio discussion feature that LinkedIn is about to launch. Ian Barkin is one of the beta testers for this new system, and Ian, Melissa O'Brien from HFS, and myself are going to join together to do an audio CX chat and discussion at 1 p.m. EST. So try that out, because I think that we might be seeing many more of these kind of discussions in future.
Nice. That's really cool. And good luck with that. In terms of my own week on LinkedIn, I have to say it was quite quiet. Much like you, I didn't see as many polls that were out. There were some, but I think that the willingness of people to post flaky questions or strange content related around polls seems to be sawing off. Let's hope that's a trend for 2022.
All right, great. So that's enough of us talking on the intro. Let's go straight to the interview with Scott Broetzmann on rage and customer anger. Scott, great. It's great to have you on the podcast. So thank you very much. Now, I should mention first that I saw you mentioned in a New York Times feature that was focused on consumer anger. And you were quoted specifically because it said that you'd been surveying and studying consumer anger for some years. So tell us about your research and how did you first start exploring this area?
Right. So in 2002, I guess it would be, we formed CCMC, Customer Care Measurement Consulting. That's the private firm that I founded and work with. And my business partner had done a study for the U.S. Office of Consumer Affairs through the White House back in the middle 70s. And that was a landmark study in customer experience, which was the very first study that quantified the relationship between either a worse customer experience and bottom line consequences or a better one and the good consequences. And that particular study hadn't been replicated, I think, since maybe one time in the early 80s. So when we formed CCMC, we wanted to make a statement in the marketplace about who we were and how we thought about such things. And so we decided to replicate that study and add a question, which my co-author, Mark Grainer, thought was a silly question. It was a stupid question. But the question I wanted to add was about how angry or how upset the customer was about the problem. And the term we were going to use was called customer rage. So I had done a little bit of secondary research in the marketplace because I had read an article in the Washington Post, which was claiming that retail outlets were having trouble holding on to their frontline staff because customers were so awful and the pay was so low. And so I did a little bit of secondary research and found that there really wasn't an umbrella concept about customer rage. There were silos of research that had gone on that was rather limited. So there was air rage, there was software syndrome rage, there was, of course, car rage, which we're all familiar with, but there was no uniform set of concepts or empirical research that would delve a little deeper to understand whether consumers were angry, and if they were, why, and how they expressed their displeasure and all these sorts of things. So my co-author humored me, and we put in a few questions about rage, and lo and behold, it was actually a phenomenon worth studying. We've done the study not every year faithfully. The numbers hadn't changed enough year to year, and it's a very expensive study to do. We self-fund it. But it's now, at least in terms of lapse time, a study that spans nearly 2 decades. And it's the only real study of its type that has that longitudinality. There are some other studies that do bits and pieces of the kinds of things that we look at. And there are other studies, for instance, in the US that deal more broadly with the customer experience, such as the American Customer Satisfaction Index, but really not a lot of emphasis with good data, prescriptive data that will tell you how effectively companies are handling customers that have problems, and what are some of the emotions and consequences from a bottom line standpoint for companies. And it's an interesting place to be in these days. I during the interview with the Times, and I have a few more coming up with some other media that are equally prominent as the Times. And I said to the reporter at the time, I just didn't envision 20 years ago, this was the quote that they pulled, that this would, be what it is today, where people are beating the living hell out of one another on airplanes for various kinds of things, some of them political, some not political. And so there really wasn't, what I find interesting in reflection, there really wasn't a context for rage 2 decades ago. And now it'd be hard to talk about, sort of commercial experiences without getting into some discussion and debate about rage and what it is and how you combat it and such. And truth be told, how I got into studying anger, I'll never know. There used to be a joke in academia that you studied the things that you weren't very good at. And I guess for me, maybe that's the factor here, because I'm the most conflict avoidant person you can imagine. So why I'm studying anger, I'm not sure, but it has, I think, played well and is playing even better now that we're seeing some of the things happen in the marketplace. So that's a little bit on how we started.
That's really interesting. Yeah, and I think that distinction between the researchers that are focusing on the customer journey, customer experience, what you're doing is actually quite distinct and different to those more generic sort of studies. I think what would be interesting is to learn, have you seen a change in recent years? And I suppose particularly with the pandemic affecting the past 2 years, has this impacted the results that you've seen?
Well, it's a question we're going to be posing in the 2022 study, which will get underway. It's sort of already a little bit underway, some of the questionnaire design and such. But the study will go in the field later in the first quarter of 2022. And the last rendition of this was in 2020, which in 2019, to be probably a little bit more precise, it was before the pandemic. A lot of the data had been collected before the pandemic. So we really don't know yet what the relative impact of COVID in particular and some of the political things that have gone on. We don't know yet. Later, we can maybe talk a bit about one of the waves of the study in 2013 that we did, which did ask people about their political affiliation and looked at some of the main kinds of key performance measures that are included in the study. But for our proprietary clients, we're of course asking lots of questions about how customers feel about how companies are handling and being responsive to their needs during the pandemic. And by and large, I would say that customers are giving companies a break. I would this is anecdotal, but across the dozens of studies we do for different clients, I'd say that maybe 70-ish% of customers feel pretty darn good about how responsive companies have been during the pandemic, combating, of course, a lot of the additional barriers to good service that have crept into the day-to-day service experience as a result of COVID. But the impact on rage at this point is unknown. Certainly, there have been some changes over the years, and we can talk about some of those as well. But I'm very interested, as are many others, to see how some of the macro measures in the study may or may not move in response to what's going on in the marketplace right now.
Yeah, and I think that's particularly interesting in the United States. I mean, you mentioned there that some of the problems have become politicized as well. Even though this has actually been a health or medical emergency, it's ended up becoming almost like a political statement, whether you wear a mask going to the grocery store or not. And so,
yeah.
have we seen, like, specific sort of sectors like retail or travel, perhaps, actually being more of a catalyst for rage rather than some other sectors then?
Yeah, and those have changed a little bit over time. Right now, at least from the 2020 study, the 5 sectors that are are the sectors where, as a customer, you're most likely to experience a problem, which is how the rage study is framed, by the way. So we ask people, in the last 12 months, have you had a problem with a product or a service? And that number has gone up dramatically since the White House study that I mentioned earlier. In fact, it's more than doubled. And so now, roughly two-thirds of American consumers would say in the last year they had a problem. I'd like to know who the 1/3 are that haven't had the problem, because I need some of their karma to, organize my day by day experience, because I have a lot of problems with products and services. But another story. So the five sectors that have the most problems are tech sectors. So that's like, internet, software, laptops, those sort of things. The cable, satellite TV sector, the automotive sector, the mobile or cell phone sector, and then the airlines. And by far the biggest areas where consumers are reporting problems have to do with the tech and the cable and satellite TV sectors. Those two together account for about 1/3 of the reported problems in the rage study. The way that I sort of interpret what is seen in those data, that variability by sector, is a lot of these things are what I might call lifestyle products. They are things that have, maybe in the old days wouldn't have been as prominent in all of our everyday experiences as a consumer. Now they're vital. I mean, what would you do without your computer or your cell phone? And God forbid you should miss the latest episode of Lilyhammer. If for us, that's what we've been watching lately. But if I couldn't watch that, particularly in a pandemic, even though our data are not reflecting on the pandemic, things go south pretty quick as far as my happiness as a consumer. So there's some variability. It's not always tied to what I would call in-person or retail settings. In fact, many of the problems have very little to do with in-person interactions. They're all either by telephone or not face-to-face, I guess it would be. They're all by telephone or by digital primarily. But those are the 5 sectors. I would say as well, just as an aside, one of the other things we hear from a lot of companies, in particular some of our clients, we do a lot of business to business work. And the rage study is focusing on business to consumer. But when we have asked the rage question itself is one question. How upset were you on a 5-point scale? When we ask that question in our proprietary business to business studies, it's not uncommon that somewhere between 30 and 50% of business to business customers say that they too experience rage. It's probably dampened a bit because in a business to business setting, you are frequently, engaged in, in some cases, multi-million-dollar kinds of relationships, and you depend on one another. And some of that contempt and emotion and raw emotion, as it might be expressed, gets dampened a little bit, not always, but there's a common myth in the marketplaces which will work, that business to business customers don't experience, it doesn't apply, and it really does apply to business as well.
Yeah, that's interesting, because business to business, I mean, throughout the pandemic, it's become much more electronic. It's very hard to get together in person for meetings. It's very hard to travel, or it has been hard to travel. And so a lot of the business to business relationships have been sort of using social networks like LinkedIn, and I think that that must be changing the dynamics slightly. And I was thinking of this because of the difference between maybe a traditional cable company. You mentioned that cable TV was one of the sections where a lot of consumers have a problem. But have you noticed a big difference then between the approach of the traditional cable channels and the newer streaming services? I mean, are Netflix, Amazon, Disney, all of these channels, are they considered different and maybe offering a better service compared to the traditional cable?
I'm not sure that we have any data that would speak directly to the difference in the experience overall, or the difference in the problem handling experience by individual company. Partly that's a limitation of the scope of the study that we do, because the study is broadly pitched at representing the US population by the census, rather than something like American Customer Satisfaction Index, which is a much more robust study that not just only covers the US population, but they're going on specific industry and reporting at that level. We complete roughly 1,000 interviews each time we do the study, and you would need a study that was much larger in scope to deal with company specific. I don't know that I could answer that one with a lot of detail.
No, that's fine. That's fine. I mean, one of the other industries you mentioned where there's recurring problems is airlines. And I think that just from reading the news, we see recurring problems. And I think that, here's an industry where the pandemic has directly affected the service that they are offering. And it seems interesting that they're having to walk a tightrope. They need to keep customers safe. There is a pandemic, and there's ongoing changes in the pandemic, the new variants that keep cropping up. So the airlines are remaining cautious, but then that attracts criticism from some customers. But then if they drop safety protocols, that will also attract criticism from another group of customers. So how does a business like an airline kind of walk that tightrope and avoid sparking rage or anger amongst their passengers?
Yeah, I don't know that it can. Honestly, I think the world in which we live in has become so divided, so tribal. And the ability of a business to be responsive to all different parts of all different tribes, if you will, can be severely limited. I mean, I was going to say jokingly, depending on which side of the coin you're on, airlines either did the right thing or the wrong thing by limiting alcohol sales on the planes. That was, one of the earlier lines in the sand that was drawn as a preventative mechanism for the rage that was being observed on the planes. But the way that I look at that question is really geared around more customer behavior and what we don't know about why customers feel so emboldened and empowered to behave badly. One of the studies we wanted to do for a very long time, but have been unable to get going on the ground, is a companion study that looks at rage from the service provider's point of view. Customers, customers behaving badly, and what are some of their experiences and their emotions, and how would those that are providing service to us, react to and think about prevention of some of that bad behavior? Because I think that would be very telling. I think some people would argue that the democratization of using social and the web has been a principal cause for people to go off the handle, if you will, figuring that they have something important to say, and it's sort of what your grandma might have told you, that everybody has an opinion, not everybody should share it. And so I to some degree come at the question of what could airlines or other businesses do to combat rage, and I start with the assumption that at some level, if you assume that it's a relationship between a company and a customer, and that it's not all one-sided, where it's all about companies doing something. It has to be about customers doing something, and that something is to, wherever possible, try and behave a little better. There's when you think about the frontline service provider, no one ever thought, just as, and I'm going to get a little political here in the U.S., there was at one point there was a suggestion that teachers should be equipped with guns in the classroom. That was the solution for gun control. And very few teachers went into teaching thinking that what they were going to do is be U.S. Marshals in the classroom. There's no training for that. Certainly, those who favor that policy would argue there could be. And in a similar sense, in the open marketplace, no one goes to be a waiter or a bartender at a restaurant and believe that their job is going to be the enforcer, as to when people should wear masks and how they should, and how to approach them and how to settle that conflict in a responsible way. That's just not part of the training. They have many other sorts of things that they're equipped to do. There's call centers that will, in their selection of representatives, will have very fancy software and algorithms and tests that permit them to get underneath the person and understand whether they have the right characteristics and mentality and emotional stability to work in the industry. And, are they going to have to start adding criteria that have to do with, particularly for those in retail settings, how are you going to police and enforce bad behavior in the customer population? It's just, no one's going to want to do those jobs. So long diatribe on your question of, how can the airlines get it right? If I broaden that to the general marketplace, it's as much about customers getting it right as it is about companies, when it comes to managing rage and bad behavior.
Yeah, and I mean, I was going to follow on by asking you if your data gives any insight into steps you can use to defuse rage, but I guess from what you just said that it's almost like an entirely separate study. You're observing how people are behaving in your existing study, but then how do you turn it around and nudge the customer towards good behavior is a different story.
Yeah, I think at some level, another way to approach that particular question, to your point, one side of the equation is definitely about behaviors of the company and psychologically and behaviorally, how can a representative manage through a difficult situation? And in my prior company, we had a program called Diffusion of Anger with a variety of interactive techniques that one could use to diffuse the situation and get customers to a mental state where they felt that they could negotiate. But I think the other important part of the equation that often is left abandoned or is often abandoned is understanding what customers want. So one of the key findings from the rage study, we introduced it, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 waves in, so it hadn't been there since the beginning. But we started asking people, did you get what you want? And we gave them a whole list of remedies, things they might want: an apology, an explanation, free product, a refund, those kinds of things. Some of the things were money related, some of them were not money related. And what we found and continue to find is more than half of customers with a problem indicate that they didn't get anything at all. Forget about getting what they wanted. They got nothing. And when I quote that figure to a corporate practitioner in customer experience, they often are either aghast or they're in a state of disbelief. They don't believe it. They think it's not a true number. And truth be told, we didn't do the rage study from the position of a consumer advocate. That's not who we are. We, candidly make our money by working with companies to help them understand the voice of the customer and to put into practice changes that will transform how they do business in that regard. So we're not an advocate, but one half of customers with problems saying they got nothing is a big number and a principal cause of some of the rage and its manifestations. Because if I broaden that scope, I say companies are out of touch frequently with understanding what consumers want, and either if it's through surveys or if it's through social media or if it's through the interaction itself, diagnosing what someone wants and meeting them on their part of the playing field for what they want is so essential to engendering a greater level of satisfaction with the experience and the side benefit of mitigating some of the frustration and rage that consumers feel. It's the number one key driver in all our proprietary work when we're looking at what is it that a company should do in order to drive a higher level of satisfaction in responding to customer questions and problems. Give them what they want. Now, of course, the retort from most corporate folks is we'd be out of business if we gave them what they wanted. All they want is money. The bunch of cheap customers that come to us and try and game the system so they can get something for free. Nothing could be further from the truth, because the most prominent things that customers want are what I call psychological currency. They want things that are of a non-monetary value, to be treated with dignity, to receive an explanation, to have a chance to vent their part of the story. Now, that said, I do know as well from the most recent study, the 2020 study, when a company couples what we call goodwill money, I'm going to give you a refund, or I'm going to give you the next purchase for free, or whatever it might be. You couple money with non-monetary remedies, the psychological currency, the satisfaction is the highest. It's lowest, believe it or not, if you just give them money. People have a sense of when they're being treated without dignity. You're trying to buy their satisfaction. It's the reason why, by the way, one of the worst practices in business that has existed for years but just refuses to go away is when you're going to finish a transaction with a business. You buy a car, you go to have your car serviced, you go to buy a mobile phone, whatever it might be, and they say, hey, Scott, you're going to get a survey next week. And it's really important to me that you give me a 10. I need a 10. My job depends on a 10. I'm going to get a raise if I get a 10. I won't get fired if you give me a 10. And consumers hate that. I mean, we know that from other research. So this idea of how can you begin to get in front of rage? How can you prevent it? How can you create a better experience when people have problems? I think at some level is also very, sort of up here, strategic. Get in touch with consumer expectations in a way different than you're used to it. And by all means, try and identify what your customers want and how you can deliver against that expectation, rather than spending all your time training frontline reps on how to use the computer.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I personally, I've had exactly the experience you're talking about with both Chevrolet and Volkswagen recently, where I'll take the car in the shop, get service, and I'm perfectly happy with the service. But then they call me, and then they text me, and then they email me, and it's endlessly asking for a good rating. And then it actually makes my opinion of the service go down just because they're chasing the rating.
That's for sure. The study I'm quoting, which was not the one referenced in the Times, and we've been talking more about the rage study, was a study we either called the Gospel Truths or the Conventional Wisdom Study. And what it did is we gave customers, hundreds of them, a list of things that typically would happen to them in a customer care transaction. And we asked them to rate those on a scale from 0 to 10. 10 would be that it's a really good practice, and 0 would be that it dissatisfies them. And so we had this list of, I don't know, maybe 70 or 80 telephone practices, and I don't know, another 40 or 50 email related practices. But at the bottom of the list as a great dissatisfier was when a company basically begs you for a positive rating on the surveys. It's completely counterintuitive, to many companies. But the reason we call it conventional wisdom is that most companies go about their business on the customer experience using what they think rather than what they know is a driver of the customer experience.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Okay, just to wrap up then, I wanted to ask you about how you feel rage and anger may well dissipate as we get past the pandemic. But I realize, from what you've said during the interview, that you probably don't have the feedback on your rage research or enough feedback yet to give a comment on that. But maybe if you could just comment, based on your own experience of your corporate work, then, how are things settling down? I mean, are we kind of returning to a rage pre-pandemic, or has something really changed?
Yeah, well, I think something really has changed. So we can look back on the historical findings of the rage study to get a sense of the level of change and where things change and where they don't. And I've begun trying to piece together more of the data points across the years, which is, of course, one of the great benefits when you do the study as long as we've had. And it's clear to me, a couple of things are clear to me in regard to your question. Number one, rage itself appears to be a relatively steady state number. If you look at just using the question, how upset were you? That number has maybe gone as low as the high 50 percentages and as high as the middle to high 60 percentage points over the many years we've done the study. So it doesn't move a lot. What has moved more was one of the numbers I quoted earlier, which was the fact that problem experience has doubled. So the propensity for rage has increased, maybe not because of the societal things we're looking at, but because products and services are much more complicated. In many cases, they're not always very good. They've become part of your lifestyle. And as a result, you have more problems. I think that's one thing that we'll continue to see, that the problem experience will go up. So in 1976, it was like 32%, and now it's like 66%. So that's certainly a big change and will continue. We saw a change in 2011-ish, starting, I guess it would be in 2013, the 2013 studies going forward, where the percentage of people that were either yelling or cursing has gone up. And that's not a very socially desirable answer to give to a stranger, whether it's by internet survey or telephone survey, that you're a person that likes to scream and cuss at people when you get angry. I mean, that number is probably underreported. But the fact that it's gone up sort of from the last decade to the more current decade, we'll see what it is in 2022. I imagine that those numbers will go up a little bit. So I think that, rage in a commercial setting, in commercial transactions is here to stay. The question is, how can it be moderated or mediated? What are some ways to dampen it? We've talked a bit about companies being better at being attentive to voice of the customer kinds of indicators, doing things on the front line. But I think that my guess is when we do the 2022 data and release it, we're going to find that it's either as high or higher than it had been in prior years. I think that's a fairly safe assumption. What's changed as well, I mean, one other thing I would say, a lot of the anger and rage that people are focusing on now is coming from a different place. Our study, as I've said a few times, is concentrating on where do we see rage when people have an unmet expectation related to their use of a product or service. And the traditional definition of an unmet need relative to the product or service is something about the actual product or service, not something about, let's say, the belief systems or political views of the proprietor. But maybe those things are now fair game and in play. Maybe, depending on how you look at it, consumers feel so emboldened to say, well, it's not just about the product or service that you made, it's about the intentions or value system that you practice. Think about, here's another political example in that regard. In the US, we had a situation a couple of years ago where somebody was suing a bakery that I think they either refused to make them a cake or they made them a cake, and it had to do with their position on sexual orientation. And since when did that become a problem? People's values or businesses' values in, whether I'm going to be happy or not with the product, whether I'm going to express, rage and displeasure. But I also look at the virtue signaling that goes on in the marketplace now as a companion to that. I mean, if you don't think that value systems are part of the commercial transaction, you needn't look much further than the tremendous amount of advertising and PR that companies are sinking into value or virtue signaling to make the audience think that they're on the right side of the equation. So I think rage is here to stay. I think it will go up or down in response to some of these other things. And I think, certainly as we do the 2022 study, I'll be looking to add questions to the questionnaire that begin to get a little bit under the skin now relative to this sort of blending of the original conceptualization of rage, in terms of unmet expectation of the product versus, what are the politics of the businesses in question. That's going to be tricky, but we'll stumble around on that for a year or two in the next study.
Thanks for listening to the CX Files podcast. We really appreciate your feedback and suggestions. You can reach myself, Mark Hillary, or Peter Ryan via LinkedIn. Please also leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast provider, as that helps more people to find us. As always, we'd like to thank Chris Haig at Traction Media for the CX Files graphics. See you next week.